Chapter 5 of What Katy Did Next. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Corey Samuel. What Katy Did Next by Susan Coolidge. Chapter 5. Storybook England. "Oh, is it raining?" was Katy's first question next morning when the maid came to call her. The pretty room with its gaily flowered chintz and china and its brass bedstead did not look half so bright as when lit with gas the night before, and a dim grey light struggled in at the window, which in America would certainly have meant bad weather coming or already come. "Oh, no, indeed, ma'am, it's a very fine day. Not bright, ma'am, but very dry," was the answer. Katy couldn't imagine what the maid meant, when she peeped between the curtains and saw a thick, dull mist lying over everything, and the pavements opposite her window shining with wet. Afterwards, when she better understood the peculiarities of the English climate, she too learned to call days not absolutely rainy fine, and to be grateful for them, but on that first morning her sensations were of bewildered surprise, almost vexation. Mrs. Ashe and Amy were waiting in the coffee room when she went in search of them. "What shall we have for breakfast?" asked Mrs. Ashe. "Our first meal in England. Katy, you order it." "Let's have all the things we have read about in books and don't have at home," said Katy eagerly. But when she came to look over the bill of fare, there didn't seem to be many such things. Soles and muffins she finally decided upon, and, as an afterthought, gooseberry jam. "Muffins sound so very good in Dickens, you know," she explained to Mrs. Ashe, "and I never saw a sole." The soles, when they came, proved to be nice little panfish, not unlike what in New England are called "scup." All the party took kindly to them, but the muffins were a great disappointment, tough and tasteless, with a flavour about them as of scorched flannel. "How queer and disagreeable they are," said Katy. "I feel as if I were eating rounds cut from an old ironing blanket and buttered. Dear me, what did Dickens mean by making such a fuss about them, I wonder? And I don't care for gooseberry jam either. It isn't half as good as the jams we have at home. Books are very deceptive." "I am afraid they are. We must make up our minds to find a great many things not quite so nice as they sound when we read about them," replied Mrs. Ashe. Mabel was breakfasting with them, of course, and was heard to remark at this juncture that she didn't like muffins either, and would a great deal rather have waffles, whereupon Amy reproved her, and explained that nobody in England knew what waffles were, they were such a stupid nation, and that Mabel must learn to eat whatever was given her and not to find fault with it. After this moral lesson it was found to be dangerously near train time, and they all hurried to the railroad station, which fortunately was close by. There was rather a scramble and confusion for a few moments, for Katy, who had undertaken to buy the tickets, was puzzled by the unaccustomed coinage, and Mrs. Ashe, whose part was to see after the luggage, found herself perplexed and worried by the absence of checks, and by no means disposed to accept the porter's statement that if she'd only bear in mind that the trunks were in a second van from the engine, and get out to see that they were safe once or twice during the journey, and call for them as soon as they reached London, she'd have no trouble. "Please remember the porter, ma'am." However, all was happily settled at last, and without any serious inconveniences they found themselves established in a first-class carriage, and presently after running smoothly at full speed across the rich English Midlands toward London and the eastern coast. The extreme greenness of the October landscape was what struck them first, and the wonderfully orderly and trim aspect of the country, with no ragged, stump-dotted fields, or reaches of wild, untended woods. Late in October as it was, the hedgerows and meadows were still almost summer-like in colour, though the trees were leafless. The delightful-looking old manor-houses and farm-houses, of which they had glimpses now and again, were a constant pleasure to Katy, with their mullioned windows, twisted chimney-stacks, porches of quaint build, and thick-growing ivy. She contrasted them with the uncompromising ugliness of farmhouses which she remembered at home, and wondered whether it could be that at the end of another 1,000 years or so America would have picturesque buildings like these to show in addition to her picturesque scenery. Suddenly, into the midst of these reflections, there glanced a picture so vivid that it almost took away her breath, as the train steamed past a pack of hounds in full cry, followed by a galloping throng of scarlet-coated huntsmen. One horse and rider were in the air, going over a wall. Another was just rising to the leap. A string of others, headed by a lady, were tearing across a meadow bounded by a little brook, and beyond that streamed the hounds following the invisible fox. It was like one of Muybridge's instantaneous photographs of the horse in motion, for the moment that it lasted, and Katy put it away in her memory, distinct and brilliant, as she might a real picture. Their destination in London was Bat's Hotel in Dover Street. The old gentleman on the Spartacus, who had "crossed" so many times, had furnished Mrs. Ashe with a number of addresses of hotels and lodging-houses, from among which Katy had chosen Bat's for the reason that it was mentioned in Mrs. Edgeworth's patronage. "It was the place," she explained, "where Godfrey Percy didn't stay when Lord Aldborough sent him the letter." It seemed an odd enough reason for going anywhere that a person in a novel didn't stay there. But Mrs. Ashe knew nothing of London and had no preference of her own, so she was perfectly willing to give Katy hers, and Bat's was decided upon. "It is just like a dream or a story," said Katy, as they drove away from the London station in a four-wheeler. "It is really ourselves, and this is really London. Can you imagine it?" She looked out. Nothing met her eyes but dingy weather, muddy streets, long rows of ordinary brick or stone houses. It might very well have been New York or Boston on a foggy day, yet to her eyes all things had a subtle difference which made them unlike similar objects at home. "Wimpole Street!" she cried suddenly, as she caught sight of the name on the corner. "That is the street where Maria Crawford, in Mansfield Park, you know, opened one of the best houses, after she married Mr. Rushworth. Think of seeing Wimpole Street! What fun!" She looked eagerly out after the best houses, but the whole street looked uninteresting and old-fashioned. The best house to be seen was not of a kind, Katy thought, to reconcile an ambitious young woman to a dull husband. Katy had to remind herself that Miss Austen wrote her novels nearly a century ago, that London was a growing place, and that things were probably much changed since that day. More fun awaited them when they arrived at Bat's, and exactly such a landlady sailed forth to welcome them as they had often met with in books. An old landlady, smiling and rubicund, with a towering lace cap on her head, a flowered silk gown, a gold chain, and a pair of fat mittened hands demurely crossed over a black brocade apron. She alone would have been worth crossing the ocean to see, they all declared. Their telegram had been received, and rooms were ready, with a bright smoky fire of soft coals. The dinner table was set, and a nice, formal, white-cravatted old waiter, who seemed to have stepped out of the same book with the landlady, was waiting to serve it. Everything was dingy and old-fashioned, but very clean and comfortable, and Katy concluded that on the whole Godfrey Percy would have done wisely to go to Bat's, and could have fared no better at the other hotel where he did stay. The first of Katy's London sights came to her next morning before she was out of her bedroom. She heard a bell ring and a queer squeaking little voice utter a speech of which she could not make out a single word. Then came a laugh and a shout, as if several boys were amused at something or other, and altogether her curiosity was roused, so that she finished dressing as fast as she could and ran to the drawing-room window, which commanded a view of the street. Quite a little crowd was collected under the window, and in their midst was a queer box raised high on poles, with little red curtains tied back on either side to form a miniature stage, on which puppets were moving and vociferating. Katy knew in a moment that she was seeing her first Punch and Judy. The box and the crowd began to move away. Katy, in despair, ran to Wilkins, the old waiter, who was setting the breakfast table. "Oh, please stop that man," she said. "I want to see him." "What man is it, miss?" said Wilkins. When he reached the window, and realized what Katy meant, his sense of propriety seemed to receive a severe shock. He even ventured on remonstrance. "I wouldn't, miss, if I were you. Them punches are a low lot, miss. They hought to be put down, really they hought. Gentlefolks, as a general thing, pays no attention to them." But Katy didn't care what gentlefolks did or didn't do, and insisted upon having Punch called back. So Wilkins was forced to swallow his remonstrances and his dignity, and go in pursuit of the objectionable object. Amy came rushing out, with her hair flying, and Mabel in her arms, and she and Katy had a real treat of Punch and Judy, with all the well-known scenes, and perhaps a few new ones thrown in for their especial behoof, for the showman seemed to be inspired by the rapturous enjoyment of his little audience of 3 at the first-floor windows. Punch beat Judy and stole the baby, and Judy banged Punch in return, and the constable came in, and Punch outwitted him, and the hangman and the devil made their appearance duly, and it was all perfectly satisfactory, and just exactly what she hoped it would be, and it quite made up for the muffins, Katy declared. Then, when Punch had gone away, the question arose as to what they should choose, out of the many delightful things in London, for their first morning. Like 99 Americans out of 100, they decided on Westminster Abbey, and indeed there is nothing in England better worth seeing, or more impressive, in its dim, rich antiquity, to eyes fresh from the world which still calls itself new. So to the Abbey they went, and lingered there till Mrs. Ashe declared herself to be absolutely dropping with fatigue. "If you don't take me home and give me something to eat," she said, "I shall drop down on one of those pedestals and stay there, and be exhibited for ever after as an effigy of somebody belonging to ancient English history." So Katy tore herself away from Henry VII and the Poet's Corner, and tore Amy away from a quaint little tomb shaped like a cradle, with the marble image of a baby in it, which had greatly taken her fancy. She could only be consoled by the promise that she should come again and stay as long as she liked. She reminded Katy of this promise the very next morning. "Mamma has waked up with rather a bad headache, and she thinks she will lie still and not come to breakfast," she reported. "And she sends her love, and says will you please have a cab, and go where you like, and if I won't be a trouble, she would be glad if you would take me with you. And I won't be a trouble, Miss Katy, and I know where I wish you would go." "Where is that?" "To see that cunning little baby again that we saw yesterday. I want to show her to Mabel. She didn't go with us, you know, and I don't like to have her mind not improved. And, darling Miss Katy, mayn't I buy some flowers and put them on the baby? She's so dusty and old that I don't believe anybody has put flowers for her for ever so long." Katy found this idea rather pretty, and willingly stopped at Covent Garden, where they bought a bunch of late roses for 18 pence, which entirely satisfied Amy. With them in her hand and Mabel in her arms, she led the way through the dim aisles of the Abbey, through grates and doors and up and down steps, the guide following, but not at all needed, for Amy seemed to have a perfectly clear recollection of every turn and winding. When the chapel was reached, she laid the roses on the tomb with gentle fingers, and a pitiful, reverent look in her grey eyes. Then she lifted Mabel up to kiss the odd little baby effigy above the marble quilt, whereupon the guide seemed altogether surprised out of his composure, and remarked to Katy, "Little Miss is an American, as is plain to see. No English child would be likely to think of doing such a thing." "Do not English children take any interest in the tombs of the Abbey?" asked Katy. "Oh yes, mum, interest, but they don't take no special notice of one tomb above another." Katy could scarcely keep from laughing, especially as she heard Amy, who had been listening to the conversation, give an audible sniff, and inform Mabel that she was glad she was not an English child, who didn't notice things, and liked grown-up graves as much as she did dear little cunning ones like this. Later in the day, when Mrs. Ashe was better, they all drove together to the quaint old keep, which has been the scene of so many tragedies, and is known as the Tower of London. Here they were shown various rooms and chapels and prisons, and among the rest the apartments where Queen Elizabeth, when a friendless young princess, was shut up for many months by her sister Queen Mary. Katy had read somewhere, and now told Amy, the pretty legend of the 4 little children who lived with their parents in a tower, and used to play with the royal captive, and how one little boy brought her a key which he had picked up on the ground, and said, "Now you can go out when you will, lady," and how the lords of the council, getting wind of it, sent for the children to question them, and frightened them and their friends almost to death, and forbade them to go near the princess again. A story about children always brings the past much nearer to a child, and Amy's imagination was so excited by this tale that when they got to the darksome closet, which is said to have been the prison of Sir Walter Raleigh, she marched out of it with a pale and wrathful face. "If this is English history, I mean never to learn any more of it, and neither shall Mabel," she declared. But it is not possible for Amy, or anyone else, not to learn a great deal of history simply by going about London. So many places are associated with people or events, and seeing the places makes one care so much more for the people or the events, that one insensibly questions and wonders. Katy, who had browsed all through her childhood in a good old-fashioned library, had her memory stuffed with all manner of little scraps of information and literary allusions, which now came into use. It was like owning the disjointed bits of a puzzle, and suddenly discovering that, properly put together, they make a pattern. Mrs. Ashe, who had never been much of a reader, considered her young friend a prodigy of intelligence, but Katy herself realized how inadequate and inexact her knowledge was, and how many bits were missing from the pattern of her puzzle. She wished with all her heart, as everyone wishes under such circumstances, that she had studied harder and more wisely while the chance was in her power. On a journey you cannot read to advantage. Remember that, dear girls, who are looking forward to travelling some day, and be industrious in time. October is not a favourable month in which to see England. Water, water is everywhere. You breathe it, you absorb it, it wets your clothes, and it dampens your spirits. Mrs. Ashe's friends advised her not to think of Scotland at that time of year. One by one, their little intended excursions were given up. A single day and night in Oxford and Stratford-on-Avon, a short visit to the Isle of Wight, where, in a country place which seemed provokingly pretty as far as they could see it for the rain, lived that friend of Mrs. Ashe who had married an Englishman, and in so doing had, as Katy privately thought, renounced the sun. A peep at Stonehenge from under the shelter of an umbrella, and an hour or two in Salisbury Cathedral, was all that they accomplished, except a brief halt at Winchester, that Katy might have the privilege of seeing the grave of her beloved Miss Austen. Katy had come abroad with a terribly long list of graves to visit, Mrs. Ashe declared. They laid a few rain-washed flowers upon the tomb, and listened with edification to the verger, who inquired, "Whatever was it, ma'am, that lady did which brings so many Americans to ask about her? Our English people don't seem to take the same interest." "She wrote such delightful stories," explained Katy, but the old verger shook his head. "I think it must have been some other party, miss, you've confused with this here. It stands to reason, miss, that we'd have heard of them over here in England sooner than you would over there in America, if the books had been anything so extraordinary." The night after their return to London, they were dining for the second time with the cousins of whom Mrs. Ashe had spoken to Dr. Carr, and as it happened, Katy sat next to a quaint elderly American, who had lived for 20 years in London, and knew it much better than most Londoners do. This gentleman, Mr. Alan Beach, had a hobby for antiquities, old books especially, and passed half his time at the British Museum, and the other half in salesrooms and the old shops in Wardour Street. Katy was lamenting over the bad weather which stood in the way of their plans. "It is so vexatious," she said. "Mrs. Ashe meant to go to York and Lincoln and all the cathedral towns, and to Scotland, and we have had to give it up all because of the rains. We shall go away having seen hardly anything." "You can see London." "We have. That is, we have seen the things that everybody sees." "But there are so many things that people in general do not see. How much longer are you to stay, Miss Carr?" "A week, I believe." Why don't you make out a list of old buildings which are connected with famous people in history, and visit them in turn? I did that the second year after I came. I gave up 3 months to it, and it was most interesting. I unearthed all manner of curious stories and traditions." "Or," cried Katy, struck with a sudden bright thought, "why mightn't I put into the list some of the places I know about in books, novels as well as history, and the places where the people who wrote the books lived?" "You might do that, and it wouldn't be a bad idea either," said Mr. Beach, pleased with her enthusiasm. "I will get a pencil after dinner and help you with your list if you will allow me." Mr. Beach was better than his word. He not only suggested places and traced a plan of sightseeing, but on 2 different mornings he went with them himself, and his intelligent knowledge of London added very much to the interest of the excursions. Under his guidance the little party of 4, for Mabel was never left out, it was such a chance for her to improve her mind, Amy declared, visited the Charterhouse where Thackeray went to school, and the home of the Poor Brothers connected with it, in which Colonel Newcome answered "Adsum" to the roll call of the Angels. They took a look at the small house in Curzon Street, which is supposed to have been in Thackeray's mind when he described the residence of Becky Sharp, and the other house in Russell Square, which is unmistakably that where George Osborne courted Amelia Sedley. They went to service in the delightful old church of St. Mary in the Temple, and thought of Ivanhoe, and Brian de Bois Guilbert, and Rebecca the Jewess. From there Mr. Beach took them to Lamb's Court, where Pendennis and George Warrington dwelt in chambers together, and to Brick Court, where Oliver Goldsmith passed so much of his life, and the little rooms in which Charles and Mary Lamb spent so many sadly happy years. On another day they drove to Whitefriars for the sake of Lord Glenvarloch and the old privilege of sanctuary in the Fortunes of Nigel, and took a peep at Bethnal Green, where the blind beggar and his pretty Bessie lived, and at the old prison of the Marshalsea, made interesting by its associations with little Dorrit. They also went to see Milton's house and St. Giles's Church, in which he is buried, and stood a long time before St. James's Palace, trying to make out which could have been Miss Burney's windows when she was dresser to Queen Charlotte of bitter memory. And they saw Paternoster Row and No. 5 Cheyne Walk, sacred forevermore to the memory of Thomas Carlyle, and Whitehall, where Queen Elizabeth lay in state and King Charles was beheaded, and the state-rooms of Holland House, and by great good luck had a glimpse of George Eliot getting out of a cab. She stood for a moment while she gave her fare to the cabman, and Katy looked as one who might not look again, and carried away a distinct picture of the unbeautiful, interesting, remarkable face. With all this to see and to do, the last week sped all too swiftly, and the last day came before they were at all ready to leave what Katy called Storybook England. Mrs. Ashe had decided to cross by Newhaven and Dieppe, because someone had told her of the beautiful old town of Rouen, and it seemed easy and convenient to take it on the way to Paris. Just landed from the long voyage across the Atlantic, the little passage of the Channel seemed nothing to our travellers, and they made ready for their night on the Dieppe steamer with the philosophy which is born of ignorance. They were speedily undeceived. The English Channel has a character of its own which distinguishes it from other seas and straits. It seems made fractious and difficult by nature, and set as on purpose to be barrier between 2 nations who are too unlike to easily understand each other, and are the safer neighbours for this wholesome difficulty of communication between them. The chop was worse than usual on the night when our travellers crossed. The steamer had to fight her way inch by inch, and oh, such a little steamer, and oh, such a long night. End of chapter 5.
Chapter 6 of What Katy Did Next. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Porrick. What Katy Did Next by Susan Coolidge. Chapter 6. Across the Channel. Dawn had given place to day, and day was well advanced toward noon before the stout little steamer gained her port. It was hours after the usual time for arrival. The train for Paris must long since have started, and Katy felt dejected and forlorn as, making her way out of the terrible ladies' cabin, she crept on deck for her first glimpse of France. The sun was struggling through the fog with a watery smile, and his faint beams shone on a confusion of stone piers higher than the vessel's deck, intersected with canal-like waterways, through whose intricate windings the steamer was slowly threading her course to the landing-place. Looking up, Katy could see crowds of people assembled to watch the boat come in, workmen, peasants, women, children, soldiers, customs-house officers, moving to and fro, and all this crowd were talking all at once, and all were talking French. I don't know why this should have startled her as it did. She knew, of course, that people of different countries were liable to be found speaking their own languages, but somehow the spectacle of the chattering multitude, all seeming so perfectly at ease with the preterites and subjunctives, and never once having to refer to Ollendorff or a dictionary, filled her with a sense of dismayed surprise. "Good gracious!" she said to herself. "Even the babies understand it." She racked her brains to recall what she had once known of French, but very little seemed to have survived the horrors of the night. "Oh dear, what is the word for trunky?" she asked herself. "They will all begin to ask questions, and I shall not have a word to say, and Mrs. Ashe will be even worse off, I know." She saw the red-trousered customs-house officers pounce upon the passengers as they landed one by one, and she felt her heart sink within her. But after all, when the time came, it did not prove so very bad. Katy's pleasant looks and courteous manner stood her in good stead. She did not trust herself to say much, but the officials seemed to understand without saying. They bowed and gestured, whisked the keys in and out, and in a surprisingly short time all was pronounced right. The baggage had passed, and it and its owners were free to proceed to the railway station, which fortunately was close at hand. Inquiry revealed the fact that no train for Paris left till 4 in the afternoon. "I am rather glad," declared poor Mrs. Ashe, "for I feel too used up to move. I will lie here on this sofa, and, Katy dear, please see if there's an eating place, and get some breakfast for yourself and Amy, and send me a cup of tea." "I don't like to leave you alone," Katy was beginning, but at that moment a nice old woman who seemed to be in charge of the waiting-room appeared, and with a flood of French which none of them could follow, but which was evidently sympathetic in its nature, flew at Mrs. Ashe and began to make her comfortable. From a cupboard in the wall she produced a pillow, from another cupboard a blanket. In a trice she had one under Mrs. Ashe's head and the other wrapped round her feet. "Pauvre madame," she said, "si pâle, si souffrant. Il faut avoir quelque chose à boire et à manger tout de suite." She trotted across the room and into the restaurant which opened out of it, while Mrs. Ashe smiled at Katy and said, "You see you can leave me quite safely. I am to be taken care of." And Katy and Amy passed through the same door into the buffet, and sat down at a little table. It was a particularly pleasant-looking place to breakfast in. There were many windows with bright polished panes and very clean short muslin curtains, and on the window-sills stood rows of thrifty potted plants in full bloom, marigolds, balsams, nasturtiums, and many-coloured geraniums. 2 birds in cages were singing loudly. The floor was waxed to a glass-like polish. Nothing could have been whiter than the marble of the tables except the napkins laid over them. And such a good breakfast as was presently brought to them. Delicious coffee in bowl-like cups, crisp rolls and rusks, an omelette with a delicate flavour of fine herbs, stewed chicken, little pats of freshly churned butter without salt, shaped like shells and tasting like solidified cream, and a pot of some sort of nice preserve. Amy made great delighted eyes at Katy, and remarking, "I think France is heaps nicer than that old England," began to eat with a will, and Katy herself felt that if this railroad meal was a specimen of what they had to expect in the future, they had indeed come to a land of plenty. Fortified with a satisfactory breakfast, she felt equal to a walk, and after they had made sure that Mrs. Ashe had all she needed, she and Amy and Mabel set off by themselves to see the sights of Dieppe. I don't know that travellers generally have considered Dieppe an interesting place, but Katy found it so. There was a really old church and some quaint buildings of the style of 2 centuries back, and even the more modern streets had a novel look to her unaccustomed eyes. At first they only ventured a timid turn or two, marking each corner and going back now and then to reassure themselves by a look at the station. But after a while, growing bolder, Katy ventured to ask a question or two in French, and was surprised and charmed to find herself understood. After that she grew adventurous, and no longer fearful of being lost, led Amy straight down a long street lined with shops, almost all of which were for the sale of articles in ivory. Ivory wares are one of the chief industries of Dieppe. There were cases full, windows full, counters full, of the most exquisite combs and brushes, some with elaborate monograms in silver and colours, others plain. There were boxes and caskets of every size and shape, ornaments, fans, parasol handles, looking-glasses, frames for pictures large and small, napkin rings. Katy was particularly smitten with a paper knife in the form of an angel, with long slender wings raised over its head and meeting to form a point. Its price was 20 francs, and she was strongly tempted to buy it for Clover or Rose Red. But she said to herself sensibly, "This is the first shop I have been into, and the first thing I've really wanted to buy, and very likely as we go on I shall see things I like better and want more, so it would be foolish to do it. No, I won't." And she resolutely turned her back on the ivory angel and walked away. The next turn brought them to a gay-looking little market-place, where old women in white caps were sitting on the ground beside baskets and panniers full of apples, pears, and various queer and curly vegetables, none of which Katy recognized as familiar. Fish of all shapes and colours were flapping in shallow tubs of sea-water. There were piles of stockings, muffetees, and comforters in vivid blue and red worsted, and coarse pottery glazed in bright patterns. The faces of the women were brown and wrinkled. There were no pretty ones among them, but their black eyes were full of life and quickness, and their fingers one and all clicked with knitting needles, as their tongues flew equally fast in the chatter and the chaffer, which went on without stop or stay, though customers did not seem to be many and sales were few. Returning to the station, they found that Mrs. Ashe had been asleep during their absence, and seemed so much better that it was with greatly amended spirits that they took their places in the late afternoon train, which was to set them down at Rouen. Katy said they were like the wise men of the East, following a star, in their choice of a hotel, for, having no better advice, they had decided upon one of those thus distinguished in Baedeker's guidebook. The star did not betray their confidence, for the Hôtel de la Cloche, to which it led them, proved to be quaint and old, and very pleasant of aspect. The lofty chambers with their dimly frescoed ceilings, and beds curtained with faded patch, might to all appearances have been furnished about the time when Columbus crossed the ocean blue, but everything was clean and had an air of old-time respectability. The dining-room, which is evidently of more modern build, opened into a square courtyard where oleanders and lemon trees in boxes stood round the basin of a little fountain, whose tinkle and plash blended agreeably with the rattle of the knives and forks. In one corner of the room was a raised and railed platform, where behind a desk sat the mistress of the house, busy with her account books, but keeping an eye the while on all that went forward. Mrs. Ashe walked past this personage without taking any notice of her, as Americans are wont to do under such circumstances. But presently the observant Katy noticed that everyone else, as they went in or out of the room, addressed a bow or a civil remark to this lady. She quite blushed at the recollection afterward, as she made ready for bed. "How rude we must have seemed," she thought. "I am afraid the people here think that Americans have awful manners. Everybody is so polite. They said bonsoir and merci and voulez-vous avoir la bonté to the waiters even. Well, there is one thing. I am going to reform. Tomorrow I'll be as polite as anybody. They will think that I am miraculously improved by one night on French soil, but never mind. I am going to do it." She kept her resolution, and astonished Mrs. Ashe next morning by bowing to the dame on the platform in the most winning manner, and saying, "Bonjour, madame," as they went by. "But, Katy, who is that person? Why do you speak to her?" "Don't you see that they all do? She's the landlady, I think. At all events, everybody bows to her. And just notice how prettily these ladies at the next table speak to the waiter. They do not order him to do things as we do at home. I noticed it last night, and I liked it so much that I made a resolution to get up and be as polite as the French themselves this morning." So all the time they went about the sumptuous old city, rich in carvings and sculptures and traditions, while they were looking at the cathedral and the wonderful church of St. Ouen, and the palace of Justice, and the place of the Maid, where poor Jeanne d'Arc was burned and her ashes scattered to the winds. Katy remembered her manners, and smiled and bowed, and used courteous prefixes in a soft, pleasant voice, and as Mrs. Ashe and Amy fell in with her example more or less, I think the guides and coachmen and the old women who showed them over the buildings felt that the air of France was very civilizing indeed, and that these strangers from savage countries over the sea were in a fair way to be as well bred as if they had been born in a more favoured part of the world. Paris looked very modern after the peculiar quaint richness and air of the Middle Ages which distinguished Rouen. Rooms had been engaged for Mrs. Ashe's party in a pension near the Arc d'Étoile, and there they drove immediately on arriving. The rooms are not in the pension itself, but in a house close by. A sitting-room with 6 mirrors, 3 clocks, and a pinched little grate about a foot wide. A dining-room just large enough for a table and 4 chairs, and 2 bedrooms. A maid called Amandine had been detailed to take charge of these rooms and serve their meals. Dampness, as Katy afterwards wrote to Clover, was the first impression they received of gay Paris. The tiny fire in the tiny grate had only just been lighted, and the walls and the sheets and even the blankets felt chilly and moist to the touch. They spent their first evening in hanging the bedclothes round the grate and piling on fuel. They even set the mattresses up on edge to warm and dry. It was not very enlivening, it must be confessed. Amy had taken a cold. Mrs. Ashe looked worried, and Katy thought of Burnet and the safety and comfort of home with a throb of longing. The days that ensued were not brilliant enough to remove this impression. The November fog seemed to have followed them across the Channel, and Paris remained enveloped in a wet blanket which dimmed and hid its usually brilliant features. Going about in cabs with the windows drawn up, and now and then making a rush through the drip into shops, was not exactly delightful, but it seemed pretty much all that they could do. It was worse for Amy, whose cold kept her indoors and denied her even the relaxation of the cab. Mrs. Ashe had engaged a well-recommended elderly English maid to come every morning and take care of Amy while they were out, and with this respectable functionary, whose ideas were of a rigidly British type, and who did not speak a word of any language but her own, poor Amy was compelled to spend most of her time. Her only consolation was in persuading the serene attendant to take part in the French lessons which she made a daily point of giving to Mabel out of her own little phrase-book. "Wilkins is getting on, I think," she told Katy one night. "She says biscuit glacé quite nicely now. But I never will let her look at the book, though she always wants to, for if once she saw how the words are spelled, she would never in the world pronounce them right again. They look so very different, you know." Katy looked at Amy's pale little face and eager eyes with a real heartache. Her rapture when at the end of the long dull afternoons her mother returned to her was touching. Paris was very triste to poor Amy, with all her happy facility for amusing herself, and Katy felt that the sooner they got away from it the better it would be. So, in spite of the delight which her brief glimpses at the Louvre gave her, and the fun it was to go about with Mrs. Ashe and see her buy pretty things, and the real satisfaction she took in the one perfectly made walking suit to which she had treated herself, she was glad when the final day came, when the belated dressmakers and artistes in jackets and wraps had sent home their last wares, and the trunks were packed. It had been rather the fault of circumstances than of Paris. But Katy had not learned to love the beautiful capital as most Americans do, and did not feel at all as if she wanted that her reward of virtue should be to go there when she died. There must be more interesting places for live people, and ghosts too, to be found on the map of Europe, she was sure. Next morning, as they drove slowly down the Champs-Élysées and looked back for a last glimpse of the famous arch, a bright object met their eyes, moving vaguely against the mist. It was the gay red wagon of the Bon Marche, carrying bundles home to the dwellers of some uptown street. Katy burst out laughing. "It's an emblem of Paris," she said. "Of our Paris, I mean. It has been all Bon Marche and fog." "Miss Katy," interrupted Amy, "do you like Europe? For my part, I was never so disgusted with any place in my life." "Poor little bird, her views of Europe are rather dark just now, and no wonder," said her mother. "Never mind, darling. You shall have something pleasanter by and by if I can find it for you." "Burnet is a great deal pleasanter than Paris," pronounced Amy decidedly. "It doesn't keep always raining there, and I can take walks, and I understand everything that people say." All that day they sped southward, and with every hour came a change in the aspect of their surroundings. Now they made brief stops in large busy towns which seemed humming with industry. Now they whirled through grape countries with miles of vineyards, where the brown leaves still hung on the vines. Then again came glimpses of old Roman ruins, amphitheatres, viaducts, fragments of wall or arch, or a sudden chill betokened their approach to mountains, where snowy peaks could be seen on the far horizon. And when the long night ended and day roused them from broken slumbers, behold, the world was made over. Autumn had vanished, and the summer, which they thought fled for good, had taken his place. Green woods waved about them, fresh leaves were blowing in the wind, roses and hollyhocks beckoned from white-walled gardens, and before they had done with exclaiming and rejoicing, the Mediterranean shot into view, intensely blue, with white fringes of foam, white sails blowing across, white gulls flying above it, and over all a sky of the same exquisite blue, whose clouds were white as the drifting sails in the water below, and they were at Marseilles. It was like a glimpse of paradise to eyes fresh from autumnal greys and glooms, as they sped along the lovely coast, every curve and turn showing new combinations of sea and shore, olive-crowned cliff and shining mountain peak. With every mile the blue became bluer, the wind softer, the feathery verdure more dense and summer-like. Hyères and Cannes and Antibes were passed, and then, as they rounded a long point, came the view of a sunshiny city lying on a sunlit shore. The train slackened its speed, and they knew that their journey's end was come, and they were in Nice. The place seemed to laugh with gaiety as they drove down the Promenade des Anglais, and past the English garden, where the band was playing beneath the acacias and palm trees. On one side was a line of bright-windowed hotels and pensions, with balconies and striped awnings. On the other, the long reach of yellow sand beach, where ladies were grouped on shawls and rugs, and children ran up and down in the sun, while beyond stretched the waveless sea. The December sun felt as warm as on a late June day at home, and had the same soft caressing touch. The pavements were thronged with groups of leisurely-looking people, all wearing an unmistakable holiday aspect. Pretty girls in correct Parisian costumes walked demurely beside their mothers, with cavaliers in attendance, and among these young men appeared now and again the well-known uniform of the United States Navy. "I wonder," said Mrs. Ashe, struck by sudden thought, "if by any chance our squadron is here?" She asked the question the moment they entered the hotel, and the porter, who prided himself on understanding those English, replied, "Mais oui, madame. The American fleet, it is here. That is not here, but at Villefranche, just a little 4 miles away. It is the same thing exactly." "Katy, do you hear that?" cried Mrs. Ashe. "The frigates are here, and the Natchitoches among them, of course, and we shall have Ned to go about with us everywhere. It is a real piece of good luck for us. Ladies are at such a loss in a place like this with nobody to escort them. I am perfectly delighted." "So am I," said Katy. "I never saw a frigate, and I always wanted to see one. Do you suppose they will let us go on board of them?" "Why, of course they will." Then to the porter, "Give me a sheet of paper and an envelope, please. I must let Ned know that I am here at once." Mrs. Ashe wrote her note and dispatched it before they went upstairs to take off their bonnets. She seemed to have a half hope that some bird of the air might carry the news of her arrival to her brother, for she kept running to the window as if in expectation of seeing him. She was too restless to lie down or sleep, and after she and Katy had lunched, proposed that they should go out on the beach for a while. "Perhaps we may come across Ned," she remarked. They did not come across Ned, but there was no lack of other delightful objects to engage their attention. The sands were smooth and hard as a floor. Soft pink lights were beginning to tinge the western sky. To the north shone the peaks of the Maritime Alps, and the same rosy glow caught them here and there, and warmed their greys and whites into colour. "I wonder what that can be," said Katy, indicating the rocky point which bounded the beach to the east, where stood a picturesque building of stone, with massive towers and steep pitches of roof. "It looks half like a house and half like a castle, but it's quite fascinating, I think. Do you suppose that people live there?" "We might ask," suggested Mrs. Ashe. Just then they came to a shallow river spanned by a bridge, beside whose pebbly bed stood a number of women who seemed to be washing clothes by the simple and primitive process of laying them in the water on top of the stones, and pounding them with a flat wooden paddle till they were white. Katy privately thought that the clothes stood a poor chance of lasting through these cleansing operations, but she did not say so, and made the inquiry which Mrs. Ashe had suggested, in her best French. "Celle-là?" answered the old woman whom she had addressed. "Mais c'est la pension suisse!" "A pension! Why, that means a boarding-house!" cried Katy. "What fun it must be to board there!" "Well, why shouldn't we board there?" said her friend. "You know we meant to look for rooms as soon as we were rested, and had found out a little about the place. Let us walk on and see what the pension suisse is like. If the inside is as pleasant as the outside, we could not do better, I should think." "Oh, I do hope all the rooms are not already taken," said Katy, who had fallen in love at first sight with the pension suisse. She felt quite oppressed with anxiety as they rang the bell. The pension suisse proved to be quite as charming inside as out. The thick stone walls made deep sills and embrasures for the casement windows, which were furnished with red cushions to serve as seats and lounging places. Every window seemed to command a view, for those which did not look toward the sea looked toward the mountains. The house was by no means full either. Several sets of rooms were to be had, and Katy felt as if she had walked straight into the pages of a romance when Mrs. Ashe engaged for a month a delightful suite of 3, a sitting-room and 2 sleeping chambers, in a round tower with a balcony overhanging the water, and a side window from which a flight of steps led down into a little walled garden nestled in among the masonry, where tall laurustinus and lemon trees grew, and orange and brown wallflowers made the air sweet. Her contentment knew no bounds. "I'm so glad that I came," she told Mrs. Ashe. "I never confessed it to you before, but sometimes, when we were sick at sea, you know, and when it would rain all the time, and after Amy caught that cold in Paris, I've almost wished, just for a minute or two at a time, that we hadn't. But now I would not have come for the world. This is perfectly delicious. I'm glad, glad, glad we are here, and we are going to have a lovely time, I know." They were passing out of the rooms into the hall as she said these words, and two ladies who were walking up a cross passage turned their heads at the sound of her voice. To her great surprise, Katy recognized Mrs. Page and Lily. "Why, Cousin Olivia! Is it you?" she cried, springing forward with a cordiality one naturally feels in seeing a familiar face in a foreign land. Mrs. Page seemed rather puzzled than cordial. She put up her eyeglass and did not seem to quite make out who Katy was. "It's Katy Carr, Mamma," explained Lily. "Well, Katy, this is a surprise. Who would have thought of meeting you in Nice?" There was a decided absence of rapture in Lily's manner. She was prettier than ever, as Katy saw in a moment, and beautifully dressed in soft brown velvet, which exactly suited her complexion and her pale-coloured wavy hair. "Katy Carr? Why, so it is," admitted Mrs. Page. "It is a surprise indeed. We had no idea that you were abroad. What has brought you so far from Tunket? Burnet, I mean. Who are you with?" "With my friend Mrs. Ashe," explained Katy, rather chilled by this cool reception. "Let me introduce you. Mrs. Ashe. These are my cousins, Mrs. Page and Miss Page. Amy—" "Why, where is Amy?" Amy had walked back to the door of the garden staircase, and was standing there looking down upon the flowers. Cousin Olivia bowed rather distantly. Her quick eye took in the details of Mrs. Ashe's travelling dress and Katy's dark blue ulster. "Some countrified friend from that dreadful western town where they live," she said to herself. "How foolish of Philip Carr to try and send his girls to Europe. He can't afford it, I know." Her voice was rather rigid as she inquired, "And what brings you here? To this house, I mean?" "Oh, we're coming tomorrow to stay. We've taken rooms for a month," explained Katy. "What a delicious old place it is!" "Have you?" said Lily, in a voice which did not express any particular pleasure. "Why, we are staying here too." End of Chapter 6. Across the Channel. Recording by Porrick.
Part 1 of What Katy Did Next. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. What Katy Did Next by Susan Coolidge. Chapter 7. The Pension Suisse. "What do you suppose can have brought Katy Carr to Europe?" inquired Lily, as she stood in the window, watching the three figures walk slowly down the sands. "She is the last person I expected to turn up here. I supposed she was stuck in that horrid place—what is the name of it?—where they live, for the rest of her life." "I confess I am surprised at meeting her myself," rejoined Mrs. Page. "I had no idea that her father could afford so expensive a journey." "And who is that woman that she has got along with her?" "I have no idea. Some Western friend, I suppose." "Dear me, I wish they were going to some other house than this," said Lily discontentedly. "If they were at the Revoir, for instance, or one of those places at the far end of the beach, we shouldn't need to see anything of them, or even know that they were in town. It's a real nuisance to have people spring upon you this way, people you don't want to meet, and when they happen to be relations it is all the worse. Katy will be hanging on us all the time, I'm afraid." "Oh, my dear, there is no fear of that. A little repression on our part will prevent her from being any trouble, I'm quite certain. But we must treat her politely, you know, Lily. Her father is my cousin." "That's the saddest part of it. Well, there's one thing. I shall not take her with me every time we go to the frigates," said Lily, decisively. "I am not going to inflict a country cousin on Lieutenant Worthington, and spoil all my own fun besides. So I give you fair warning, mamma, and you must manage it somehow." "Certainly, dear, I will. It would be a great pity to have your visit to Nice spoiled in any way, with the squadron here too, and that pleasant Mr. Worthington, so very attentive." Unconscious of these plans for her suppression, Katy walked back to the hotel in a mood of pensive pleasure. Europe at last promised to be as delightful as it had seemed when she only knew it from maps and books, and Nice so far appeared to her the most charming place in the world. Somebody was waiting for them at the Hôtel des Anglais, a tall, bronzed, good-looking somebody in uniform, with pleasant brown eyes beaming from beneath a gold-banded cap, at the sight of whom Amy rushed forward with her long locks flying, and Mrs. Ashe uttered an exclamation of pleasure. It was Ned Worthington, Mrs. Ashe's only brother, whom she had not met for 2 years and a half, and you can easily imagine how glad she was to see him. "You got my note, then?" she said, after the first eager greetings were over, and she had introduced him to Katy. "Note? No. Did you write me a note?" "Yes, to Villefranche." "To the ship? I shan't get that till tomorrow. No, finding out that you were here is just a bit of good fortune. I came to call on some friends who are staying down the beach a little way, and dropping in to look over the list of arrivals, as I generally do, I saw your names, and the porter not being able to say which way you had gone, I waited for you to come in." "We have been looking at such a delightful old place, the Pension Suisse, and have taken rooms." "The Pension Suisse, eh? Well, that's where I was going to call. I know some people who are staying there. It seems a pleasant house. I'm glad you are going there, Polly. It's first-rate luck that the ships happen to be here just now. I can see you every day." "But, Ned, surely you are not leaving me so soon? Surely you will stay and dine with us?" urged his sister, as he took up his cap. "I wish I could, but I can't tonight, Polly. You see I had engaged to take some ladies out to drive, and they will expect me. I had no idea that you would be here, or I should have kept myself free," apologetically. "Tomorrow I will come over early, and be at your service for whatever you like to do." "That's right, dear boy, we shall expect you." Then, the moment he was gone, "Now, Katy, isn't he nice?" "Very nice, I should think," said Katy, who had watched the brief interview with interest. "I like his face so much, and how fond he is of you." "Dear fellow, so he is. I am 7 years older than he, but we have always been intimate. Brothers and sisters are not always intimate, you know, or perhaps you don't know, for all of yours are." "Yes, indeed," said Katy, with a happy smile. "There is nobody like Clover and Elsie, except perhaps Johnny and Dorry and Phil," she added with a laugh. The remove to the Pension Suisse was made early the next morning. Mrs. Page and Lily did not appear to welcome them. Katy rather rejoiced in their absence, for she wanted the chance to get into order without interruptions. There was something comfortable in the thought that they were to stay a whole month in these new quarters. For so long a time it seemed worth while to make them pretty and homelike. So, while Mrs. Ashe unpacked her own belongings and Amy's, Katy, who had a natural turn for arranging rooms, took possession of the little parlor, pulled the furniture into new positions, laid out portfolios and work-cases and their few books, pinned various photographs which they had bought in Oxford and London on the walls, and tied back the curtains to admit the sunshine. Then she paid a visit to the little garden, and came back with a long branch of laurustinus, which she trained across the mantelpiece, and a bunch of wallflowers for their one little vase. The maid, by her orders, laid a fire of wood and pine cones ready for lighting, and when all was done she called Mrs. Ashe to pronounce upon the effect. "It is lovely," she said, sinking into a great velvet armchair which Katy had drawn close to the seaward window. "I haven't seen anything so pleasant since we left home. You are a witch, Katy, and the comfort of my life. I am so glad I brought you. Now, pray go and unpack your own things, and make yourself look nice for the second breakfast. We have been a shabby set enough since we arrived. I saw those cousins of yours looking askance at our old travelling dresses yesterday. Let us try to make a more respectable impression to-day." So they went down to breakfast, Mrs. Ashe in one of her new Paris gowns, Katy in a pretty dress of olive serge, and Amy all smiles and ruffled pinafore, walking hand in hand with her Uncle Ned, who had just arrived and whose great ally she was, and Mrs. Page and Lily, who were already seated at table, had much ado to conceal their somewhat unflattering surprise at the conjunction. For one moment Lily's eyes opened into a wide stare of incredulous astonishment. Then she remembered herself, nodded as pleasantly as she could to Mrs. Ashe and Katy, and favored Lieutenant Worthington with a pretty blushing smile as he went by, while she murmured, "Mamma, do you see that? What does it mean?" "Why, Ned, do you know those people?" asked Mrs. Ashe at the same moment. "Do you know them?" "Yes, we met yesterday. They are connections of my friend Miss Carr." "Really? There is not the least family likeness between them." And Mr. Worthington's eyes travelled deliberately from Lily's delicate, golden prettiness to Katy, who, truth to say, did not shine by the contrast. "She has a nice sensible sort of face," he thought, "and she looks like a lady, but for beauty there is no comparison between the two." Then he turned to listen to his sister as she replied, "No, indeed, not the least. No two girls could be less like." Mrs. Ashe had made the same comparison, but with quite a different result. Katy's face was grown dear to her, and she had not taken the smallest fancy to Lily Page. Her relationship to the young naval officer, however, made a wonderful difference in the attitude of Mrs. Page and Lily toward the party. Katy became a person to be cultivated rather than repressed, and thenceforward there was no lack of cordiality on their part. "I want to come and have a good talk," said Lily, slipping her arm through Katy's as they left the dining-room. "Mayn't I come now while mamma is calling on Mrs. Ashe?" This arrangement brought her to the side of Lieutenant Worthington, and she walked between him and Katy, down the hall and into the little drawing-room. "Oh, how perfectly charming! You have been fixing up ever since you came, haven't you? It looks like home. I wish we had a salon, but mamma thought it wasn't worth while, as we were only to be here such a little time. What a delicious balcony over the water, too! May I go out on it? Oh, Mr. Worthington, do see this!" She pushed open the half-closed window and stepped out as she spoke. Mr. Worthington, after hesitating a moment, followed. Katy paused uncertain. There was hardly room for three in the balcony, yet she did not quite like to leave them. But Lily had turned her back, and was talking in a low tone. It was nothing more in reality than the lightest chit-chat, but it had the air of being something confidential, so Katy, after waiting a little while, retreated to the sofa and took up her work, joining now and then in the conversation which Mrs. Ashe was keeping up with Cousin Olivia. She did not mind Lily's ill-breeding, nor was she surprised at it. Mrs. Ashe was less tolerant. "Isn't it rather damp out there, Ned?" she called to her brother. "You had better throw my shawl around Miss Page's shoulders." "Oh, it isn't a bit damp," said Lily, recalled to herself by this broad hint. "Thank you so much for thinking of it, Mrs. Ashe, but I am just coming in." She seated herself beside Katy, and began to question her rather languidly. "When did you leave home, and how were they all when you came away?" "All well, thank you. We sailed from Boston on the 14th of October, and before that I spent 2 days with Rose Red. You remember her? She is married now, and has the dearest little home and such a darling baby." "Yes, I heard of her marriage. It didn't seem much of a match for Mr. Redding's daughter to make, did it? I never supposed she would be satisfied with anything less than a member of Congress or a secretary of legation." "Rose isn't particularly ambitious, I think, and she seems perfectly happy," replied Katy, flushing. "Oh, you needn't fire up in her defense. You and Clover always did adore Rose Red, I know, but I never could see what there was about her that was so wonderfully fascinating. She never had the least style, and she was always just as rude to me as she could be." "You were not intimate at school, but I am sure Rose was never rude," said Katy with spirit. "Well, we won't fight about her at this late day. Tell me where you have been and where you are going, and how long you are to stay in Europe." Katy, glad to change the subject, complied, and the conversation diverged into comparison of plans and experiences. Lily had been in Europe nearly a year, and had seen "almost everything," as she phrased it. She and her mother had spent the previous winter in Italy, had taken a run into Russia, done Switzerland and the Tyrol thoroughly, and France and Germany, and were soon going into Spain, from there to Paris, to shop, in preparation for their return home in the spring. "Of course we shall want quantities of things," she said. "No one will believe that we have been abroad unless we bring home a lot of clothes. The lingerie and all that is ordered already, but the dresses must be made at the last moment, and we shall have a horrid time of it, I suppose. Worth has promised to make me 2 walking suits and 2 ball dresses, but he's very bad about keeping his word. Did you do much when you were in Paris, Katy?" "We went to the Louvre 3 times, and to Versailles and St. Cloud," said Katy, wilfully misunderstanding her. "Oh, I didn't mean that kind of stupid thing. I meant gowns. What did you buy?" "One tailor-made suit of dark blue cloth." "My, what moderation!" Shopping played a large part in Lily's reminiscences. She recollected places, not from their situation, or beauty, or historical associations, or because of the works of art which they contained, but as the places where she bought this or that. "Oh, that dear Piazza di Spagna," she would say, "that was where I found my rococo necklace, the loveliest thing you ever saw, Katy." Or, "Prague, oh yes, mother got the most enchanting old silver chatelaine there, with all kinds of things hanging to it, needle cases and watches and scent bottles, all solid and so beautifully chased." Or again, "Berlin was horrid, we thought, but the amber is better and cheaper than anywhere else. Great strings of beads of the largest size and that beautiful pale yellow, for 100 francs. You must get yourself one, Katy." Poor Lily! Europe to her was all things. She had collected trunks full of objects to carry home, but of the other collections which do not go into trunks, she had little or none. Her mind was as empty, her heart as untouched as ever. The beauty and the glory and the pathos of art and history and nature had been poured out in vain before her closed and indifferent eyes. Life soon dropped into a peaceful routine at the Pension Suisse, which was at the same time restful and stimulating. Katy's first act in the morning, as soon as she opened her eyes, was to hurry to the window in hopes of getting a glimpse of Corsica. She had discovered that this elusive island could almost always be seen from Nice at the dawning, but that as soon as the sun was fairly up, it vanished, to appear no more for the rest of the day. There was something fascinating to her imagination in the hovering mountain outline between sea and sky. She felt as if she were under an engagement to be there to meet it, and she rarely missed the appointment. Then, after Corsica had pulled the bright mists over its face and melted from view, she would hurry with her dressing, and as soon as was practicable set to work to make the salon look bright before the coffee and rolls should appear, a little after 8 o'clock. Mrs. Ashe always found the fire lit, the little meal cosily set out beside it, and Katy's happy untroubled face to welcome her when she emerged from her room, and the cheer of these morning repasts made a good beginning for the day. Then came walking and a French lesson, and a long sitting on the beach, while Katy worked at her home letters and Amy raced up and down in the sun, and then toward noon Lieutenant Ned generally appeared, and some scheme of pleasure was set on foot. Mrs. Ashe ignored his evident penchant for Lily Page, and claimed his time and attention as hers by right. Young Worthington was a good deal taken with the pretty Lily. Still he had an old-time devotion for his sister, and the habit of doing what she desired, and he yielded to her behests with no audible objections. He made a fourth in the carriage when they drove over the lovely hills which encircle Nice toward the north, to Cimiez and the Val de Saint-André, or down the coast toward Ventimiglia. He went with them to Monte Carlo and Mentone, and was their escort again and again when they visited the great war-ships, as they lay at anchor in a bay which in its translucent blue was like an enormous sapphire. Mrs. Page and her daughter were included in these parties more than once, but there was something in Mrs. Ashe's cool appropriation of her brother which was infinitely vexatious to Lily, who before her arrival had rather looked upon Lieutenant Worthington as her own especial property. "I wish that Mrs. Ashe had stayed at home," she told her mother. "She quite spoils everything. Mr. Worthington isn't half so nice as he was before she came. I do believe she has a plan for making him fall in love with Katy. But there she makes a miss of it, for he doesn't seem to care anything about her." "Katy is a nice girl enough," pronounced her mother, "but not of the sort to attract a gay young man, I shouldn't fancy. I don't believe she is thinking of any such thing. You needn't be afraid, Lily." "I'm not afraid," said Lily, with a pout, "only it's so provoking." Mrs. Page was quite right. Katy was not thinking of any such thing. She liked Ned Worthington's frank manners. She owned, quite honestly, that she thought him handsome, and she particularly admired the sort of deferential affection which he showed to Mrs. Ashe, and his nice ways with Amy. For herself, she was aware that he scarcely noticed her except as politeness demanded that he should be civil to his sister's friend, but the knowledge did not trouble her particularly. Her head was full of interesting things, plans, ideas. She was not accustomed to being made the object of admiration, and experienced none of the vexations of a neglected belle. If Lieutenant Worthington happened to talk to her, she responded frankly and freely. If he did not, she occupied herself with something else. In either case she was quite unembarrassed both in feeling and manner, and had none of the awkwardness which comes from disappointed vanity and baffled expectations, and the need for concealing them. End of Section 1 of Chapter 7.
Part 2 of What Katy Did Next. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lenny. What Katy Did Next by Susan Coolidge. Chapter 7, Part 2. The Pension Suisse. Toward the close of December, the officers of the flagship gave a ball, which was the great event of the season to the gay world of Nice. Americans were naturally in the ascendant on an American frigate, and of all the American girls present, Lily Page was unquestionably the prettiest. Exquisitely dressed in white lace, with bands of turquoises on her neck and arms and in her hair, she had more partners than she knew what to do with, more bouquets than she could well carry, and compliments enough to turn any girl's head. Thrown off her guard by her triumphs, she indulged a little vindictive feeling which had been growing in her mind of late, on account of what she chose to consider certain derelictions of duty on the part of Lieutenant Worthington, and treated him to a taste of neglect. She was engaged 3 deep when he asked her to dance. She did not hear when he invited her to walk. She turned a cold shoulder when he tried to talk, and seemed absorbed by the other cavaliers, naval and otherwise, who crowded about her. Piqued and surprised, Ned Worthington turned to Katy. She did not dance, saying frankly that she did not know how and was too tall, and she was rather simply dressed in the pearl-gray silk which had been her best gown the winter before in Bernay, with a bunch of red roses in the white lace of the tucker and another in her hand, both the gifts of little Amy. But she looked pleasant and serene, and there was something about her which somehow soothed his disturbed mind as he offered her his arm for a walk on the decks. For a while they said little, and Katy was quite content to pace up and down in silence, enjoying the really beautiful scene, the moonlight on the bay, the deep wavering reflections of the dark hulls and slender spars, the fairy effect of the coloured lamps and lanterns, and the brilliant moving maze of the dancers. "Do you care for this sort of thing?" he suddenly asked. "What sort of thing do you mean?" "Oh, all this jigging and waltzing and amusement." "I don't know how to jig, but it's delightful to look on," she answered merrily. "I never saw anything so pretty in my life." The happy tone of her voice and the unruffled face which she turned upon him quieted his irritation. "I really believe you mean it," he said. "And yet, if you won't think me rude to say so, most girls would consider the thing dull enough if they were only getting out of it what you are, if they were not dancing, I mean, and nobody in particular was trying to entertain them." "But everything is being done to entertain me," cried Katy. "I can't imagine what makes you think that it could seem dull. I am in it all, don't you see? I have my share. Oh, I am stupid. I can't make you understand." "Yes, you do. I understand perfectly, I think. Only it is such a different point of view from what girls in general would take." By girls he meant Lily. "Please do not think me uncivil." "You are not uncivil at all. But don't let us talk any more about me. Look at the lights between the shadows of the masts on the water. How they quiver! I never saw anything so beautiful, I think. And how warm it is! I can't believe that we are in December, and that it is nearly Christmas." "How is Polly going to celebrate her Christmas? Have you decided?" "Amy is to have a Christmas tree for her dolls, and 2 other dolls are coming. We went out this morning to buy things for it, tiny little toys and candles fit for Lilliput. And that reminds me, do you suppose one can get any Christmas greens here?" "Why not? The place seems full of green." "That's just it. The summer look makes it unnatural. But I should like some to dress the parlor with, if they could be had." "I'll see what I can find, and send you a load." I don't know why this very simple little talk should have made an impression on Lieutenant Worthington's mind, but somehow he did not forget it. "Don't let us talk any more about me," he said to himself that night when alone in his cabin. "I wonder how long it would be before the other one did anything to divert the talk from herself. Some time, I fancy." He smiled, rather grimly, as he unbuckled his sword-belt. It is unlucky for a girl when she starts a train of reflection like this. Lily's little attempt to pick her admirer had somehow missed its mark. The next afternoon Katy, in her favorite place on the beach, was at work on the long weekly letter which she never failed to send home to Burnett. She held her portfolio in her lap, and her pen ran rapidly over the paper, as rapidly almost as her tongue would have run could her correspondence have been brought nearer. Nice, December 22nd. Dear Papa and everybody, Amy and I are sitting on my old purple cloak, which is spread over the sand just where it was spread the last time I wrote you. We are playing the following game. I am a fairy, and she is a little girl. Another fairy, not sitting on the cloak at present, has enchanted the little girl, and I am telling her various ways by which she can work out her deliverance. At present, the task is to find 24 dull red pebbles of the same color, failing to do which she is to be changed into an owl. When we began to play, I was the wicked fairy, but Amy objected to that, because I am so nice, so we changed the characters. I wish you could see the glee in her pretty gray eyes over this infantile game, into which she has thrown herself so thoroughly that she half believes in it. "But I needn't really be changed into an owl," she says, with a good deal of anxiety in her voice. To think that you are shivering in the first snowstorm, or sending the children out with their sleds and india-rubbers to slide! How I wish, instead, that you were sharing the purple cloak with Amy and me, and could sit all this warm balmy afternoon close to the surf-line which fringes this bluest of blue seas. There is plenty of room for you all. Not many people come down to this end of the beach, and if you were very good, we would let you play. Our life here goes on as delightfully as ever. Nice is very full of people, and there seem to be some pleasant ones among them. Here, at the Pension Suisse, we do not see a great many Americans. The fellow boarders are principally Germans and Austrians, with a sprinkling of French. Amy has found her 24 red pebbles, so she is let off from being an owl. She is now engaged in throwing them one by one into the sea. Each must hit the water, under penalty of her being turned into a Muscovy duck. She doesn't know exactly what a Muscovy duck is, which makes her all the more particular about her shots. But, as I was saying, our little suite in the round tower is so on one side of the rest of the pension that it is as good as having a house of our own. The salon is very bright and sunny. We have 2 sofas and a square table and a round table and a sort of what-not, and 2 easy-chairs and 2 uneasy-chairs, and a lamp of our own, and a clock. There's also a sofa-pillow. There's richness for you. We have pinned up all our photographs on the walls, including Papa's and Clovy's, and that bad one of Phil and Johnny making faces at each other, and 3 lovely red and yellow Japanese pictures on muslin, which Rose Red put in my trunk, the last thing, for a spot of color. There are some autumn leaves, too, and we always have flowers, and in the mornings and evenings a fire. Amy is now finding 50 snow-white pebbles, which, when found, are to be interred in one common grave among the shingle. If she fails to do this, she is to be changed to an electrical eel. The chief difficulty is that she loses her heart to particular pebbles. "I can't bury you," I hear her saying. To return. We have jolly little breakfasts together in the salon. They consist of coffee and rolls, and are served by a droll, snappish little garçon with no teeth, and an Italian-French patois, which is very hard to understand when he sputters. He told me the other day that he had been a garçon for 46 years, which seemed rather a long boyhood. The company, as we meet them at table, are rather entertaining. Cousin Olivia and Lily are on their best behaviour to me, because I am travelling with Mrs. Ashe, and Mrs. Ashe is Lieutenant Worthington's sister, and Lieutenant Worthington is Lily's admirer, and they like him very much. In fact, Lily has intimated confidentially that she is all but engaged to him. But I am not sure about it, or if that was what she meant, and I fear, if it proves true, that dear Polly will not like it at all. She is quite unmanageable, and snubs Lily continually in a polite way, which makes me fidgety for fear Lily will be offended, but she never seems to notice it. Cousin Olivia looks very handsome and gorgeous. She quite takes the colour out of the little Russian countess who sits next to her, and who is as dowdy and meek as if she came from Akron or Binghamton or any other place where countesses are unknown. Then there are 2 charming, well-bred young Austrians. The one who sits nearest to me is a candidate for a doctorate of laws, and speaks 8 languages well. He has only studied English for the past 6 weeks, but has made wonderful progress. I wish my French were half as good as his English is already. There is a very gossiping young woman on the story beneath ours, whom I meet sometimes in the garden, and from her I hear all manner of romantic tales about people in the house. One little French girl is dying of consumption and a broken heart because of a quarrel with her lover, who is a courier. And the padrona, who is young and pretty, and has only been married a few months to our elderly landlord, has a story also. I forget some of the details, but there was a stern parent, and an admirer, and a cup of cold poison, and now she says she wishes she were dying of consumption like poor Alphonsine. For all that, she looks quite fat and rosy, and I often see her in her best gown, with a great deal of Roman scarf and mosaic jewellery, stationed in the doorway, making the pension look attractive to the passers-by. So she has a sense of duty, though she's unhappy. Amy has buried all her pebbles, and says she is tired of playing fairy. She is now sitting with her head on my shoulder, and professedly studying her French verb for to-morrow, but in reality, I'm sorry to say, she's conversing with me about beheadings, a subject which, since her visit to the Tower, has exercised a horrible fascination over her mind. "Do people die right away?" she asks. "Don't they feel 1 minute, and doesn't it feel awfully?" There's a good deal of blood, she supposes, because there was so much straw laid about the block in the picture of Lady Jane Grey's execution, which enlivened our walls in Paris. On the whole, I'm rather glad that a fat little white dog has come waddling down the beach and taken off her attention. Speaking of Paris seems to renew the sense of fog which we had there. Oh, how enchanting sunshine is after weeks of gloom! I shall never forget how the Mediterranean looked when we saw it first, all blue, and such a lovely colour. There ought, according to Morse's atlas, to have been a big red letter T on the water about where we were, but I didn't see any. Perhaps they letter it so far out from shore that only people in boats notice it. Now the dusk is fading, and the odd chill which hides under these warm afternoons begins to be felt. Amy has received a message written on a mysterious white pebble to the effect— Katy was interrupted at this point by a crunching step on the gravel behind her. "Good afternoon," said a voice. "Polly has sent me to fetch you and Amy in. She says it is growing cool." "We were just coming," said Katy, beginning to put away her papers. Ned Worthington sat down on the cloak beside her. The distance was now steel grey against the sky. Then came a stripe of violet, and then a broad sheet of the vivid iridescent blue which one sees on the necks of peacocks, which again melted into the long line of flashing surf. "See that gull?" he said. "How it drops plumb into the sea, as if bound to go through to China!" "Mrs. Hawthorne calls skylarks little raptures," replied Katy. "Seagulls seem to me like grown-up raptures." "Are you going?" said Lieutenant Worthington in a tone of surprise, as she rose. "Didn't you say that Polly wanted us to come in?" "Why, yes. But it seems too good to leave, doesn't it? Oh, by the way, Miss Carr, I came across a man to-day and ordered your greens. They will be sent on Christmas Eve. Is that right?" "Quite right, and we are ever so much obliged to you." She turned for a last look at the sea, and, unseen by Ned Worthington, formed her lips into a good night. Katy had made great friends with the Mediterranean. The promised greens appeared on the afternoon before Christmas Day, in the shape of an enormous faggot of laurel and laurustinus and holly and box. Orange and lemon boughs with ripe fruit hanging from them, thick ivy tendrils whole yards long, arbutus, pepper-tree, and great branches of acacia, covered with feathery yellow bloom. The man apologized for bringing so little. The gentleman had ordered 2 francs worth, he said, but this was all he could carry. He would fetch some more if the young lady wished. But Katy, exclaiming with delight over her wealth, wished no more. So the man departed, and the 3 friends proceeded to turn their little salon into a fairy bower. Every photograph and picture was wreathed in ivy, long garlands hung on either side the windows, and the chimney-piece and door-frames became clustering banks of leaf and blossom. A great box of flowers had come with the greens, and bowls of fresh roses and heliotrope and carnations were set everywhere. violets and primroses, gold-hearted brown auriculas, spikes of veronica, all the zones and all the seasons, combining to make the Christmas-tide sweet and to turn winter topsy-turvy in the little parlour. Mabel and Mary Matilda, with their two dull visitors, sat gravely round the table, in the laps of their little mistresses, and Katy, putting on an apron and an improvised cap, and speaking Irish very fast, served them with a repast of rolls and cocoa, raspberry jam, and delicious little almond cakes. The fun waxed fast and furious, and Lieutenant Worthington, coming in with his hands full of parcels for the Christmas tree, was just in time to hear Katy remark, in a strong County Kerry brogue, "Oh, then indade, Miss Amy, and it's no more cake you'll be getting out of me to-night. That's 4 pieces you ate, and it's little slate your poor mother'll get you with a tossing and tumbling forninst to her all night long because of your big appetite." "Oh, Miss Katy, talk Irish some more!" cried the delighted children. "Is it Irish you'd be after having me talk, when it's me own language, and sorrow a bit of another, do I know?" demanded Katy. Then she caught sight of the new arrival, and stopped short with a blush and a laugh. "Come in, Mr. Worthington," she said. "We're at supper, as you see, and I am acting as waitress." "Oh, Uncle Ned, please go away," pleaded Amy, "or Katy will be polite, and not talk Irish any more." "Indade, and the less you say about politeness the better, when you're after ordering the gentleman out of the room in that fashion," said the waitress. Then she pulled off her cap and untied her apron. "Now for the Christmas tree," she said. It was a very little tree, but it bore some remarkable fruits, for, in addition to the tiny toys and candles fit for Lilliput, various parcels were found to have been hastily added at the last moment for various people. The Natchitoches had lately come from the Levant, and delightful Oriental confections now appeared for Amy and Mrs. Ashe: Turkish slippers, all gold embroidery; towels, with richly decorated ends in silks and tinsel; all the pretty superfluities which the East holds out to charm gold from the pockets of her Western visitors. A pretty little dagger in agate and silver fell to Katy's share out of what Lieutenant Worthington called his loot, and beside a most beautiful specimen of the inlaid work for which Nice is famous, a looking-glass with a stand and little doors to close it in, which was a present from Mrs. Ashe. It was quite unlike a Christmas Eve at home, but altogether delightful. And as Katy sat next morning on the sand, after the service in the English church, to finish her home letter, and felt the sun warm on her cheek, and the perfumed air blow past as softly as in June, she had to remind herself that Christmas is not necessarily synonymous with snow and winter, but means the great central heat and warmth, the advent of Him who came to lighten the whole earth. A few days after this pleasant Christmas they left Nice. All of them felt a reluctance to move, and Amy loudly bewailed the necessity. "If I could stay here till it is time to go home, I shouldn't be homesick at all," she declared. "But what a pity it would be not to see Italy," said her mother. "Think of Naples and Rome and Venice." "I don't want to think about them. It makes me feel as if I was studying a great long geography lesson, and it tires me so to learn it." "Amy, dear, you're not well." "Yes, I am, quite well. Only I don't want to go away from Nice." "You only have to learn a little bit at a time of your geography lesson, you know," suggested Katy, "and it's a great deal nicer way to study than out of a book." But though she spoke cheerfully, she was conscious that she shared Amy's reluctance. "It's all laziness," she told herself. "Nice has been so pleasant that it has spoiled me." It was a consolation, and made going easier, that they were to drive over the famous Cornice road as far as San Remo, instead of going to Genoa by rail, as most travellers nowadays do. They departed from the Pension Suisse early on an exquisite morning, fair and balmy as June, but with a little zest and sparkle of coolness in the air which made it additionally delightful. The Mediterranean was of the deepest violet blue. A sort of bloom of colour seemed to lie upon it. The sky was like an arch of turquoise. Every cape and headland shone jewel-like in the golden sunshine. The carriage, as it followed the windings of the road cut shelf-like on the cliffs, seemed poised between earth and heaven, the sea below, the mountain summits above, with a fairy world of verdure between. The journey was like a dream of enchantment and rapidly changing surprises, and when it ended in a quaint hostelry at San Remo, with palm trees feathering the Bordighera Point and Corsica, for once seen by day, lying in bold, clear outlines against the sunset, Katy had to admit to herself that Nice, much as she loved it, was not the only, not even the most beautiful place in Europe. Already she felt her horizon growing, her convictions changing, and who should say what lay beyond? The next day brought them to Genoa, to a hotel, once the stately palace of an archbishop, where they were lodged, all three together, in an enormous room, so high and broad and long that their three little curtain-beds set behind a screen of carved wood made no impression on the space. There were not less than 4 sofas and double that number of arm-chairs in the room, besides a couple of monumental wardrobes, but, as Katy remarked, several grand pianos could still have been moved in without anybody's feeling crowded. On one side of them lay the port of Genoa, filled with craft from all parts of the world and flying the flags of a dozen different nations. From the other they caught glimpses of the magnificent old city, rising in tier over tier of churches and palaces and gardens, while nearer still were narrow streets which glittered with gold filigree and the shops of jewel-workers. And while they went in and out and gazed and wondered, Lily Page, at the Pension Suisse, was saying, "I'm so glad that Katy and that Mrs. Ashe are gone. Nothing has been so pleasant since they came. Lieutenant Worthington is dreadfully stiff and stupid, and seems quite different from what he used to be. But now that we have got rid of them, it will all come right again." "I really don't think that Katy was to blame," said Mrs. Page. "She never seemed to me to be making any effort to attract him." "Oh, Katy is sly," responded Lily vindictively. "She never seems to do anything, but somehow she always gets her own way. I suppose she thought I didn't see her keeping him down there on the beach the other day when he was coming in to call on us, but I did. It was just out of spite, and because she wanted to vex me. I know it was." "Well, dear, she's gone now, and you won't be worried with her again," said her mother soothingly. "Don't pout so, Lily, and wrinkle up your forehead. It's very unbecoming." "Yes, she's gone," snapped Lily. "And as she's bound for the East and we for the West, we are not likely to meet again, for which I am devoutly thankful." Chapter 7